Hey, Laird.
Hey, good
Hey,
morning.
good morning. Nice to have you here. Thank you so much for coming and for spending some time with us this morning. I'm super excited to hear about your new book. Before we dive into that, I would also like to talk to you a little bit about your comparative cosmology with the Dogons and how the way that you handle the language and the interpretations is much different from the traditional ways of handling the interpretations. And that has brought you vast discoveries. So your work with the Dogon has led you all over the whole world with this.
Right, and the reason for that is that you remember Jung noticing that there were certain symbols and myths and themes that were archetypes all around the world, and that's the system that I'm tracking is an ancient symbolic system that when you get to the bottom of things in certain cultures, they describe as an instructed tradition back in ancient times. It was a combination of a civilizing plan for humanity tagged to this symbolic creation system.
Exactly.
And so my work is comparative work. What I try to do is understand more about any of those elements by comparing how different ancient cultures understood the same element. And so I sort of started out in Africa with the Dogon, who are a modern day primitive African tribe, and moved from there to comparisons to ancient Egypt, to India, to China and Tibet, to ancient Turkey, um, eventually over to northern Scotland and that region, uh, as far distant as the Maori in New Zealand.
All
Um,
over the entire globe.
well, eventually it is. There are there's sort of signatures that follow these traditions, and any culture that measured with cubits is part of it. Any
Okay.
culture that imagined that there was a wheel or a chariot associated with Orion, the
Okay.
constellation, was part of it. Um, So it's a pretty widespread tradition. Any culture that claimed to have eight quasi mythical ancestors who brought them civilizing skills is part of it.
And the number 8 is significant here because that
Right.
is consistent throughout. And that
Right.
also is the number of spokes in the traditional wheel, isn't it?
Right. That's right.
Right.
Um, so language is a huge part of trying to interpret all of this. The Dogon tribe, who are my starting point, they're a priestly tribe, and their societal mission is to preserve original forms, and they've done that with up to 18 different subgroupings of from different languages. They have that makes their language technically unclassifiable. They have ancient Egyptian words, Hebrew words, words of the Dravidian languages of the Tamil, Turkish words, uh, traditionally African words. Um, so um,
Hmm.
those original meanings of those words have a lot to do with trying to sort out what the symbols are about. These are the same phonetics that the ancient Egyptian used in their words. The Dogon don't have a written language, but they do produce drawings to go along with the concepts, and many of those drawings, about maybe 30, 35 of those drawings, are also found in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language.
Exactly the same, or are they all like variations of
Very similar with the same meanings.
the same
So
meaning?
it's easy to make the connection. Um, the further back in time we go, the more we discover that words flatly explain to us their own meanings. Words
Right.
say what they mean. Um, Confucius at 500 AD was complaining loudly because Chinese language was no longer doing that. He was
Mm.
thought as a very great loss of education of humanity that you couldn't count on words to tell you what they meant anymore.
Right.
And so, with this system that I'm setting with the Dogon or the Egyptians, if you know how a word is pronounced, you can fairly well predict what the meaning of the word is. And it
Mm.
goes beyond that with the Egyptian words because each of the glyphs, the symbols that the Egyptian used to write their words with, um, corresponds to a concept. They're
Okay.
producing a symbolic sentence with a word that explains the meaning of the word.
Mm. So through this, they're describing an action, like an insinuated action or a personality is somewhat, I don't know exactly. I mean, how would you describe it? So, like a Chinese character is described as like a character. It's not necessarily a individual sound, but it's kind of a story, and the glyphs are about the same.
Right. Each glyph represents what I would call a root concept. I'll give you a
Okay.
really simple example of how a word works. There's an Egyptian word for the concept of a week, like our
Okay.
7 day week.
Mhm.
Looks like we're having connectivity issues, maybe because of all of the flooding that's been happening in the Hudson Valley.
I was thinking that too. We also have some solar storms coming in right now, so they were talking about a little bit of like internet issues here and there. So, do you want to try to bear through it, or how?
Yeah, I think we can. I mean, hopefully we won't get interrupted too many times here. Let's see, you're not seeing me.
I'm not seeing you.
Here we go. It's time.
There
I
you
didn't
are.
didn't
Okay.
restart my video after I came back in.
Okay.
Um, so we were talking about how the glyphs explain to you what words mean. Every Egyptian word works that same way. And in fact, ancient Chinese words work the same way. The Chinese word for week was written with the sun glyph and the number 10, and they had a 10-day week. So we have direct comparability of these ancient languages way back when. But I can take any Egyptian hieroglyphic word, and the glyphs of the word will explain to me the intended meaning of the guy who wrote the word at the time it was written down, the scribe.
Awesome.
That's a huge help because then I don't have to guess anymore what they meant when they said a certain word.
Right. And then also, like you were talking about the pronunciation of the word or the word being said, changes sometimes culturally the way it's spelt maybe, but the meaning of the word remains the same. And like the way that you were describing it, you say that it has components of all these other languages, but it really sounds like all those other languages have components of it.
Right. It looks like it all started out as the same system, and the Dogon do us the favor of preserving all of the root syllables.
Okay.
So the way the Dogon language works, the Dogon don't have a written language, but each syllable represents a concept the same way each glyph in Egypt represents a concept. And so if I know how a Dogon word is pronounced, I can substitute concepts for syllables and guess what the word represents. Um, and that carries over into other languages. I can take names of Hindu deities and interpret them against Dogon phonetics, and it spells out the symbolism of what the deity is.
Wow. That's incredible. And a further proof is also in the architecture that translates from those two areas, or obviously other regions, but we'll let that jump us to there. From the architecture is the same, and that's also one of the ways that you traveled around the world with the Dogon.
Right, that there are common architectural forms they build. There's the grand symbol of this symbolic tradition is a shrine. In
Mhm.
India, it's called a stupa, and for the Dogon, they refer to it as a granary shrine, but it's the same basic concept. A yurt in Siberia or Mongolia is a portable version of the same kind of a shrine. A pyramid in Egypt, the Great Pyramid in Egypt, is an example of the same kind of a shrine, and they all carry the same clusters of symbolism and the same basic elements of how they were laid out and aligned to the cardinal points of north, south, east, and west. It's all the same system.
Is all the same system. And that's also what you found when you got to Orkney, right? When you got to Scarabrea, you found structures that resembled homes that the Dogons also built, but without the hearth.
Yes, I was asked if I thought there could have been ancient Egyptian influences in northern Scotland on Orkney Island, which is a very remote spot. The first farming village in the United Kingdom was excavated on Orkney Island. It's called Scarabrea. And I was asked if I thought at 3200 BC that though we could be seeing Egyptian influences there. And I realized pretty quickly that we probably couldn't be. That's too early for ancient Egypt. But there's very little evidence on Orkney to try to interpret. And one of the things we have is the plan of a stone house that was built in this village. All of the houses were built to the same plan. And it turns out the Dogon tribe, when they build stone houses, build to the same plan. And they do so because they assign cosmological symbolism to the house plan. The house includes a round room that on one end, two long rectangular rooms on the sides, a square room in the middle, and rectangular rooms at the entryway. And for the Dogon, this represents the body of a sleeping goddess. And researchers on Orkney didn't have any sense of where the architecture came from or what it represented. But once we make that connection with Dogon, then you can open up all sorts of questions of language and of cosmology to try to interpret things on Orkney.
Right, because I mean, speaking of language and words, I mean, scarab brae sounds a little bit like scarabs in a sense, you know.
Yes, it does. Actually, it comes from a similar word or a root. There was a naming convention in ancient times for all these tribes that involved the word sakai, which means to celebrate. And so the word scarak comes from a root that's similar to that. It looks like the Scarab Brae village overlooks a bay called the Bay of Scale, or Sakai El, which would mean celebrates El. El was a Canaanite god of space, who was a counterpart to Yah, the Canaanite and Hebrew god of light.
Right.
And so that's one of the ways that we make connections, is through those kinds of naming conventions that we see again and again and again around the world in various places.
Right, because Scotland also comes from Scotland means spiral. Right. I'm sorry. I wrote down when I was excited to talk to you. I made so many notes. I have like 6 pages of notes, so I should have organized them better. But Scotland is spiral. Sakat, right? The Egyptian word for spiral, and it's the Pictish.
Sakat, that's right.
Spiral.
Yep, and because we find examples of the symbols in context with each other, we can make a claim that they belong together as a group. I recently last year, I published a book called Tracing Orkney's Origins that sort of, it examines how is it that a symbolic tradition that I associate first with the Fertile Crescent region. There's a place called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey at around 9,000 BC. The question is, how did this tradition make its way from Turkey at 9,000 BC to Orkney Island in northern Scotland by around 3,000 BC?
And you just asked me the next question I was going to ask you.
Well, the researchers on Orkney don't have any sense of where their tradition came from, where the early farmers on Orkney came from. But the reason they don't is because they have all sorts of different ancient elements to think about and consider. But if they consider them one at a time, any one of them might have come there by any number of different paths. A lot of them originate in the Fertile Crescent region because that's where civilization originated. But they don't have any positive way of saying, okay, this variety of sheep made its way to Orkney by this pathway.
Right.
So I took a different approach. What I did was I looked at the different clusters of elements which happen to move with each other, sort of hand in hand across the Mediterranean, through past the large islands in the Mediterranean and up through along the coast of the Atlantic, through the Hebrides to Orkney by around 3600 BC. And so there are connections between Malta at around 3600 BC in the Mediterranean and Orkney at around 3600 BC.
Okay, and
all of the same elements we find originally on Orkney, we also find in Malta.
And that's incredible, because I also found in Armenia and Spain and throughout the whole region, and they vary in age, but we've recently there was an article about a dolmen, one of the triangular wedge dolmens that was said to be associated in some way with King Arthur, but they said that it's 6500 BC. And then things just keep getting, like Graham Hancock says, things just keep getting older. History just keeps getting older.
even Arthur himself ends up connecting to the tradition I'm talking about. When in places like ancient Greece, they have words that connect to this tradition that they're not certain where the words came from. They don't have etymology to say definitively that here's how this word originated. And the same thing on Malta. They have certain words where when they translate the word in terms of the Maltese language, it doesn't make any sense. And based on the tracing that I did from the Fertile Crescent region to Orkney, we discovered that the Faroese language, which is an ancient language on Orkney, is one of the keys to solving these mysteries, because if you examine the word in terms of that ancient language, suddenly everything makes sense. Arthur's name means light in the Faroese language. And so he's connected to the same tradition that I was just talking about, that connects to a god of space and a god of light.
Mm. And that's like AU, gold, AU, Arthur, AU, all of these light.
Yeah.
Okay, yes. Because that also, in these symbols are describing light. The thing that you're finding, and what I'm most excited about your new book, is that it's exactly parallel the Dogon's understanding of the electromagnetic fields and interactions and behaviors as what we're seeing with our high-tech instruments and big brains that we're understanding now. And they have been carrying this knowledge for millennia.
Right. The Dogon symbolic system is talking about how we get from what started out originally as energy to what ended up as matter. And it's not really that complicated a process. It's just complicated to conceptualize. And so all this complicated symbolism is there to try to help us look at these things in the right way, to understand that there's a handful of dynamics of energy that are pretty simple, that once you understand how they work the same way on all scales. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about, what dimensional scale you're talking about, or if you're talking about the scale of the universe or the scale of the atom. It's all the same stuff, playing out in exactly the same way. And so it's like this crash course in how do we understand what those basic dynamics are.
Right. And so that actually leads me to my next question, because the Big Bang, right? Like you're saying that the Dogon described the action of, or the concept of, the Big Bang. And a lot of people are having trouble with this concept, especially nowadays, because it's such a hard thing to prove or disprove, and there's a lot of weight against it. So I'm wondering how the Dogon are going to teach us and convince us that this actually did occur.
Well, okay. Imagine that you're standing in a field looking at a country road that runs up a hill away from you out into the distance. Now, if you were to analyze the image of that road using mathematics, this is a diminishing perspective that goes back to a point. If you're going to use math to analyze that, the math is going to bring you to a singularity at that point. You're going to get to a point where you're dividing by zero. The Dogons say that's the wrong way to look at things. That if we approach that road with math, it brings us to divide by zero. If we approach that road in terms of concepts of direction and distance, we learn what's over the hill when we go over the road.
Right.
From where we're standing, it looks like it diminishes to nothing, but it doesn't actually diminish to nothing. Once you get to the top of the hill, you're standing on a road. And that's sort of the way the energy works. From where we sit, it looks like all of this collapses back to a Big Bang, the singularity of a Big Bang. But when you understand the way the concepts of time and space and so on work, you realize that what's happening at that point of singularity is no different than what's happening at the top of the hill. That we have a set of circumstances of physics that are completely familiar to us, that work exactly the same way we're used to.
Okay. So that makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot more comprehensive, because we are in a three-dimensional, fourth-dimensional space, right? And so is everything. So to look at something from that foreshortened or 1 point perspective really is like the flattening of the curve, because you are giving it a finite point.
Right. And what's really going on, the main thing that's going on is that time the pace of time is slowing down.
Okay.
Now, when I use math and I do divisions, I end up at a point where I'm dividing by 0. Or if I go in the other direction, I end up at a point where I'm dealing with numbers that look like infinity.
Mm-hmm.
If I talk about things in terms of a quickening or a slowing pace of time, and I say time, the pace of time is now twice as slow as it was before, I can keep doing that again and again and again and again and never hit infinity.
Mm-hmm.
Or I can do it the opposite direction again and again and again and never hit a divide by 0.
Mm-hmm.
We have to look at the questions qualitatively, not quantitatively, in order to get our arms around what's going on. And then the math is there to help confirm it. That's how Einstein worked, and other researchers. They Einstein, everything Einstein theorized began as sort of a thought game that he would play with himself. He would conceptualize how things had to work, and then it was only later on that he got the really qualified mathematicians to verify that for him mathematically.
Yes, because imagination, the imaginative process is like unlimited, whereas mathematics, or at least our understanding of it at present, gives us our understanding of it as present as the limit. We're confined until the imagination expands that.
And one researcher I was reading was saying you reach a point where things are so small that the math is no longer adequate to try to describe it, because as things get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, from where we stand, it looks like they unify into one thing.
Right.
And it's hard to use mathematics, which is depending on things being individual, not being unified, to work. Math is not the right tool to try to sort out what's going on. What you need is an overview and then work from that.
Which is more of like a geometric, like more of a like platonic solid kind of a way of approaching it, because it gives you points in all dimensions that are kind of congruent, and then you can look at how that pattern reforms into a solid shape or a solid idea or concept, right? And so when to illustrate that further is like what that slowing down of time. In 709 BC, like all the calendars changed, and suddenly the eclipses started to make sense, and that's really interesting, and kind of speaks to some concepts of the pendulum effect, and when things line up sometimes and separate sometimes, and as that slows down or that rhythm in the cadence changes, things start to sway differently.
Right. Now, there's a very easy way to illustrate that what the Dogon are saying is right. What the Dogon are basically saying is that because time slows down, space seems to extend for us over time. That if you imagine the wavelength of light, that has a certain number of cycles per second, and now you lengthen the time a second takes, those cycles get longer and longer and longer and longer over time. Well, when we look back at the Big Bang, at the time of the Big Bang, there were gamma rays emitted. Gamma rays have a very quick wavelength, very short wavelength. But scientists who want to measure those gamma waves now have to look at them as microwaves, not as gamma waves, because the wavelengths have stretched out so much over time that that's how we see them. So that transition is an illustration of exactly what the Dogon say happens over time, that time slows down and light extends.
Right, because it's an attenuation through the flux. It starts to lose its flux. It loses its charge, which is another thing, because we're talking about that in terms of like eyes, and it being when the way that you describe the eye, the concept of the eye, and the eye being open, and that's why the eye is used for Horus and for Ra, and in so many other instances, that it's a description of that aperture opening, right? And how that changes the wavelength frequencies that are coming through.
Right. And because we're talking about light, the way that we relate to light is through eyes. And it turns out that the earliest structures that form. It doesn't matter what scale we're talking about, whether we're talking about the microcosm of matter or we're talking about the universe. The first structures that form resemble eyes. They're shaped like that circle with a dot in the middle of it I was talking about.
Mhm.
And so somebody who put together this symbolic system decided to create Egyptian words that all have meanings of eyes, like the Eye of Horus and the Eye of Ra. There's a whole series of those words that we're not as familiar with as Eye of Ra or Eye of Horus. There's a whole sequence of these words where the symbolism represents what an eye, if it was positioned, or a camera, if it was positioned at a particular stage in that process, would see. And so you can almost lay out the entire scale of the process based on how those eye words work. The Dogon have a series of words that do the same thing based on the concept of water, not on the concept of eyes.
How does that relate? And I mean, in the same sense, how is water relatable to eyes?
The book that the French anthropologist Marcel Griol wrote, it's a diary of his own instruction as an initiate in the Dogon symbolic tradition. In French, he called it God of Water. That was the name of the book. And he flatly says in the book that the Dogon say that water was the design of the underlying design of the universe. In my book, Amma, and the Spark of the Universe, what it comes down to is the idea that the geometry of the energy and the material structures that are created from the energy all relate to water directly, that relate to the dynamics of a water molecule. I mean, when scientists talk about energy, they use water as a metaphor to explain how things work because the dynamics are the same thing. The dynamics of water draining down a bathtub drain are no different than the dynamics of a black hole in space.
The plasma hydrodynamics is the same because the behavior is so similar. And I've often had that thought, like, are they like plasma sheds? You know, like we have water sheds. Are they like places of low-lying area where all of the charge or all of the material kind of flows through in these ways, because everything winds up behaving, whether it be solid, liquid, or gas or plasma, everything winds up behaving with these certain characteristics. And it's within the way that energy behaves, just sometimes much slower.
And all of that connects to how water behaves and connects to how water configures, connects to the geometry of water. This is water, 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 water all the way up. And that's also why all the symbolism is water. You know, certain mythological actions happen at the face of the waters, which is the interface between non-materiality and materiality. And all of the references, the metaphors are again and again and again are water, 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 water. The pneumo, which are is a Dogon term that refers to the perfect twin pair, have symbolic connections to hydrogen atoms in water molecules. And it's just all water again and again and again.
And the pneumo fish.
And the pneumo fish, right, which is a figure that actually derives from, if we're talking about sacred geometry, the simplest form of sacred geometry is a set of figures that are used to align these shrines to the north, south, east, and west. And the reason alignment is important is because it's the nature of electricity and magnetism to configure themselves perpendicularly to each other. And that's where dimensionality comes from. That's where a lot of the interaction between electricity and magnetism happens. They move perpendicularly to each other. And it's because of that that a lot of things come about. So the pneumo fish is one of the figures that, as the first exercise that a Buddhist initiate is taught, is how to create this geometry that's used to establish where north, south, east, and west are for these shrines.
So that's foundational. Before anything else, you have to learn this.
Right. And along with that figure comes an overlap between domains. This is expressing how according to Buddhism, it recreates how matter actually emerges, how space actually emerges. And
Mm.
there are overlaps between two domains that create the shape of the Vesica Pisces.
Mhm.
And the pneumo fish of the Dogon is associated with that same shape.
That same exact shape. And that shape is repeated throughout the flower of life as it expands. You get more of that, and with that, it's like little vortices within the larger torrid, right?
Right. And it gets pretty complicated, but at the
Mm.
bottom, it's all pretty simple. And that's the
Mhm.
place where we want to try to understand it, is to try to reduce fractions down to the point where we can get our arms around, what they're really talking about, because a pattern gets established that if you understand that pattern, everything else all the way up the scale is a lot easier to figure out.
Right. Right. That's why we set the first thing you learn is how to set your parameter.
That's right.
Well, they sound like they know what they're doing.
Yeah, somebody was a really accomplished teacher. They one of the books I wrote called Primal Wisdom of the Ancients is all about the different techniques that are being used in the symbolism that reflect the skills of a really capable group of teachers.
Mm,
They
agreed.
think back on the best teachers you had in school, and the things they were doing are what these teachers were doing.
Yes, because this is how humans learn. So I think that the best teachers know people, know who we are inherently, and then that's the story, right? The
Right.
analogy, because
Yeah.
we enjoy a story. We learn better when we're enjoying ourselves, when we're having fun. So if you tell children stories, they're enjoying it and they're learning something. So I think that
Right.
carries throughout. And then they carve them in stone on these sites to show this, because that's another interesting thing and point that you bring up about Orkney, and that is okay. Besides the fact that there's never any bodies in the tombs anywhere, right? So why do we call them tombs? The other thing is forts, because obviously this village in Orkney is not meant for defense. It's not meant for an army. It's peaceful place,
Right.
and we learn best in peace, right?
Right. I mean, ancient Crete was one of the most peaceful places on the planet. Orkney was a very peaceful place. The early Egyptian villages were peaceful places. A typical Dogon village is a very peaceful place.
Because that's where we need to be to align and think with this. And you're saying that Orkney, from what I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but that Orkney may have been where the teachers lived, where like the high academia resided.
Well, what they did on Orkney was at 3200 BC, they had created these megalithic structures that are representations of the dynamics I'm talking about,
Mhm.
but on a scale that a person could walk through. They were connected by a road that led to the Scarborough village. So it was like, I don't know if you remember back in the 1990s and 2000s, there were these traveling troops that would come around to the shopping malls where they would have inflatable representations of the human body, and you could walk through the lungs and the heart and the everything. Well, that's sort of what somebody was doing with the structures of matter with these megalithic sites.
Giving you that experiential trek through,
Right.
because what they're creating in these structures is a reflection, as above so below, right? They're creating this worldwide tapestry of stars on the ground, basically,
Right. Right,
throughout.
because the stars were used. Okay, you're right. They're trying to illustrate to us the idea that there's parallelism in all these dynamics of energy.
Mhm.
Okay, and so if they can illustrate for us examples above us in the universe that repeat those same dynamics, then we have a way of intuitively connecting the fact that, oh yes, this structure of matter we were talking about, that's a tiny spiral, is like that spiral that we can see up there.
Yes.
um, then that's a way of helping us grasp the idea that these dynamics are consistent all the way up. That and so it doesn't matter that we can't actually visualize what's going on in the quantum domain directly. If
Mhm.
we know it's parallel to what happens to things we can look at, we can talk about what goes on with planets and the sun and the moon and things like that, and infer what has to go on at the quantum level.
Right. And it's always so interesting to me that out there in the big, vast expanses of space, and we look at clouds and dust, we're still looking at them as particulate, even though it's just huge, massive swaths. It's basically, coming apart and putting it back together again. And that's what the black holes kind of suck everything in, and then they recycle it and they shoot out water and they shoot out all these other elements, like everything, to recreate. So this recycling happens. And I think like it does get to the point, is that where we get like over the hill, where all of a sudden now we're coming apart and putting back together again. And it's just amazing to me that they understood these so intimately well, and that they were able to simplify it like to this degree.
Right. And another huge benefit is that it's all parallel, that the Dogon say the energy that creates matter is the same energy that creates biological forms and that creates consciousness and that form the universe. And so, almost as a way to show off, whoever put the system together simultaneously described all of those things using a single progression of symbols. And so every symbol has meaning for any of those themes we want to talk about. The same symbol that has meaning for biological conception has meaning for the formation of matter, parallel meaning. Mm-hmm. And so it makes the symbols a little more difficult to understand, but it's like memorize it once and use it a dozen times.
Right.
It's a very smart way to teach.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's making me think of colors, right? Like Roy G. Biv, all we can perceptualize and see, all the information that we get has to be through light waves, no matter what, because that's how eyeballs work. But when you say green, what is the spectrum of green, right? And so we get Roy G. Biv. Those are the letters or the associated with the colors on the spectrum. And yet everything that we can see in all of its dimensions, all of its forms, all of its uniquenesses is all just layers of those colors, layers of those symbols working.
Right. Now, that's actually one of the metaphors for the dynamic across the boundary between non-materiality and materiality, the idea of white light producing the rainbow colors, that anything that expresses itself that way, we can assume transcends that same boundary. Think of a musical tone that expresses itself as 7 musical notes of a scale. There are other things that work that way. The cosmological words work that way. They carry clusters of meanings that these are sort of discrete, unrelated, seemingly unrelated clusters of meanings that go with a particular concept that play out in culture after culture and language after language, the same cluster of meanings that go together. And so the Dogon are saying that anything that expresses itself that way, you can presume that the origin of it is on the non-material side of things, not the material side. And the fact that it expresses itself like the rainbow colors is an indicator to us that it's crossed that boundary.
So the refraction of light is that barrier crossing, is that
right
exchange in there.
The refraction of light is an illustration of unity to multiplicity, the concept of unity to multiplicity. It's the way that that energy, basically what happens is spinning energy evokes vectors, 7 vectors of energy that creates resistance. You think of a snow plow pushing snow up a street. It reaches a point where there's so much resistance from the snow in front of the plow that it ends up being shoved off to the side.
Right.
That's what happens with energy also. And those vectors of light are sort of seven vectors that got shoved off to the side by this spinning energy.
Like the wake.
Right.
Okay. And so, and then where, so those are, now there's all, so, but then it's also because we think about, when we think about refraction of light, it's also important to talk about that those aren't the only wavelengths that can be refracted. So that's all of that energy, right? If it can be broken down through that sort of.
And that's just a tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is much broader.
Exactly.
It's the central portion of that spectrum.
Exactly. So that's amazing. And then the other universes is parallel to ours, simultaneously occurring in an like etheric realm.
What the Dogon are describing are 14 superimposed universes.
Okay.
Okay, now what differentiates those universes is the pace at which time runs.
Okay.
And it's basically factors of 10. So theoretically, there's a domain right next to ours where time runs 10 times as fast as it does for us.
Wow.
Okay, we look at a black hole. The effect of a black hole is to slow time down. And so the very existence of a black hole implies that beyond that black hole, there's another domain where time runs more slowly than it does for us.
Wow.
But those 14 domains, as it turns out, the Dogon symbolism led me to understand that those domains exist and how they relate to each other. What I didn't realize till I was all done is that that's a precise description of how scientists understand the electromagnetic spectrum. They interpret the electromagnetic spectrum as 14 domains of energy differentiated by factors of 10.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like if you go down into the ocean, there are depths of the ocean where there are different ecosystems in the ocean where different kinds of life thrive.
Yes.
If you get down to the floor of the ocean, there's a whole different variety of life than there is if you're up near the surface of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
It's that kind of gradation of existence.
And also thresholds between the layers, because that's significant, because there are specific thresholds that are descriptive between those layers. The reason that they're divided the way that they are is because the behavior changes, the reactions to things change.
Right. Now you can imagine that at certain points in the cycle of energy, there's energy there's a cycle of energy that's happened that's shifting things through these domains.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to explain, but as the energy shifts, there are points in time where sort of bleed through or crossover is possible between the sections that are right next to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine back in the 1600s and before, when people were reporting interactions with fairies,
Mm-hmm.
that they might have been reporting actual effects of sort of bleed through between these domains.
These domains. So there was actually like the ability for a few moments, like the eclipses, like when things line up, where there could have been a communication and perception opening. Like that's what people talk about when they talk about the portals between them.
Right. And there were reports back in certain of those eras that if you went back to the same spot a year later, you'd see the same thing again. And so that's suggesting, the kinds of difference in time frame we're talking about, that cycles that repeat themselves.
Right. And that's basically throughout. And so new cycles repeat, and the spirals just expand into more and more spirals. Right. And that's how they,
now,
in the way.
Ultimately, the idea is that this is a cycle, that part of what my recent book is about is explaining how it is that the energy reverses while the cycle continues in a circle. Very much the way seasons, oscillate back and forth, even though the Earth is moving, as the Earth moves in a circular rotation. It's the same kind of an idea. And so trying to take the Dogon references to sort out what is the natural behavior of energy that causes that to reverse, and how does that relate to the science of it?
Right, because you think about that. I think about this. Actually, I have a globe right here. Look, I have a globe. But when it spins, it's spinning this way. So like you're constantly going east and west. You can go all the way around the world. You can go east around the globe and get to the same point that you were without ever going west.
Right.
But when you go north and south, as the globe is turning on this plane, when you go north and south on that perpendicular axis, once you hit the top point, now all of a sudden you can go north all the way from the equator, but once you hit that top point, now you're going south. So now you've changed direction.
Right.
You have to like go through the equator and come back down to that polar. to come back in. And so, but the whole while, the world's spinning in the same direction.
Right. And that's one of the important things about mathematics, that the ancients don't have a concept of negative numbers. That modern mathematicians, when they hit that point, rather than imagining they've changed directions, they now start counting negatively. And that's the wrong way to look at things to be able to get at what the Dogon are talking about.
Right, because they had the regions of the world were their directional words, right? Or how this the names of the regions of the world were all these new words. Sorry, oh, here we go. I took so many notes and I wrote on the notes. You saw there a mess. Okay, so Egypt was Taru, and China was Eru, and Ireland was Uru, Aru, Peru. Pardon me for my destruction.
No, that's right. That's right.
But those were the 4 regions of the world, and they were the cardinal points
right.
for the stage and the stages of agriculture. And we still use Peru is still what we call Peru.
Right. And Aru is the name of the top Dogon priest. A lot of the symbolism I write about in this new book expressly corresponds to the Aru priest. There are carvings made in the wooden doors of his house that are reflective of the root dynamics of magnetism and electricity. They illustrate how magnetism and electricity move, and if you could separate the two, what their root modes of motion are.
Wow. In his doorway?
It's his door, yes. And so symbolically, these are the entry points to this system. And on the cycle of energy, they actually sit as the sort of the gateway, the two, you were talking about the opposite points on the globe. These doorways are symbolic of the opposite points on the energetic globe that we were just talking about, how the cycle of energy works.
Okay, and then when he's inside it, he's in the middle of it.
Right. Now, the emergence of the catalyzing of energy to create material forms is a pushing open of those doors in the same way that the birth of an infant is the pushing open or pushing out of a baby. These are parallel processes. This is why one of the ways in which the symbolism is parallel and the concepts are parallel. We're talking about concept. Okay, it turns out that gravity actually associates with that concept of pushing, not with pulling. We think of gravity as a tugging force, but when you get back down to the bottom of how the energy works, it turns out gravity is a pushing force. It works the same way that buoyancy does. If you have a hollow plastic ball at the bottom of a swimming pool, buoyancy pushes it to the surface. It doesn't get drawn to the surface.
Right.
Gravity works the same way, only instead of it being water that's forcing it up, it's time. That's differences in time frame that's forcing it.
And that's that gravitational. Pulling. I should say pushing of it that pushes it, and then again, that's when the things can join, because we do another thing I wanted to talk to you. Only have a few more minutes. Take a few more minutes of your time, but the circle and the square, because that is a huge point where the 2 points, the exterior and the interior meet. The 2 universes, right, are kind of the circle and the square. And my question is am I interpreting that wrong?
No, you're right. I mean, that the concept of squaring a circle is a huge symbolic theme in a lot of these cultures.
Right. It's throughout. That's one of the congruencies that I've been finding. And then when we talk about the ancient mystery schools, or the ancient, we go even further back from this, because I feel like that's almost not fair, because these were intellectual centers that taught physics and cosmology and the natural world, and we see things as science. So if we can't see it as our version of science, we just pretend it's all magic, and that it was science, it was philosophy, it was natural understanding, and they put these things on their walls. So like Newgrange is also called a womb, right? It's like known as a womb, in this feminine aspect of going inside of that and squaring the circle. Because if you look at where are the four squares of the circle, well, they're right in the middle. When you divide it like this, you put, there's four squares, and they're right in the center of that circle, right in the middle of the womb, like Newgrange. And then
Right.
all these interior spaces, like that hearth that is, or not hearth, but the scarabray, and all of these interior mounts, because there's the exterior and there's the interior, and that's about the going within, and that whole shift at time where things were matriarchal gods, feminine, looking at things in a feminine aspect, right?
Mhm.
Passive, watching, right? Shifting into a masculine aspect where we are now, where it's more of action based and exterior structures.
Right, and that all has to do with the way the energy works. Magnetism takes no active role in the formation of material structures. It only guides what electricity does. It's passive. So magnetism is feminine, symbolically, and electricity is masculine, symbolically. And we have a shifting dynamic of energy that's moving from magnetism to electricity. And so the symbolism moves from feminine to masculine.
But that's a natural oscillation, don't you think?
Yeah, it is, and it's a cycle that when you get to the end of it, then automatically reverses itself and goes back the other direction.
You did the pull, and you got to come back.
Yeah, the directionality stays the same way that the rotation of the Earth stays the same, but the seasons end up reversing themselves the same way that seasons do on the planet.
Right, and this is and so what also we can probably infer from this, or see what the Dogons are telling us, is that it is, since it's scalar, it winds up being happening in the galaxy as well. This isn't just happening on our planet. This is happens in our solar system, in the community of solar system that we are, and then in our larger galaxy, and then in our neighborhood and our universe, all go through these oscillations.
Right. And it's sort of the reconciling of all these different cycles that are happening simultaneously that play out as the reality we live in.
Right, the boom. But that's just actually like how the pendulum effect works, right? That's how waves work. Every once in a while, they all just are together. Yep. Sometimes they're all apart.
Yeah.
Well, it's been absolutely wonderful. I very much appreciate you doing this and being here, and I learned so much from you all the time.
Your questions have been really insightful. It's really helpful. I appreciate how much background you have and how much you bring to this. So.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. That means a lot to me coming from you. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And if people want to find your work, your books online, they can go to you say you have a fan page, and
yeah, it's a Laird Scranton fan page, but it hasn't been maintained, and it's not really a place to do anything. So best place to find me personally is on Facebook. My books are available through my publisher Inner Traditions or Simon & Schuster, or through Amazon, or you can walk into a Barnes & Noble bookstore and likely find a couple of the books on the shelf.
Awesome. And you're all over YouTube and the internet. People want to see more videos or hear more about all of these. You've done so much.
But they shouldn't confuse me with all the other Laird Scrantons.
Yeah, like such a common name and all. And that's funny. There was because Laird is Lord, right? And so you're like
that's a Scottish name for Lord. That's right. The Scarabray Village, when it was uncovered by storms, sat on the land owned by the Laird of Scale, as a matter of fact.
So that's so yes, I could talk to you for hours, but there's a lot of consistencies and synchronicities. So maybe I could talk to you another time about some of your journey with this, because I'd love to talk.
Sure, because there's been all sorts of really interesting stuff.
That's how it goes. That's how we go through our journey, right? There's a little signpost that tell us we're going the right direction. So. I appreciate you, Laird Scranton. Thank you so much for visiting us today, and I will talk to you soon.
Great. I'd be happy to talk anytime. Thanks a lot, Heather.
Have a great afternoon.